Hyde. Hey, we just got through the Independence Day holiday. I hope you had a chance to celebrate. I hope you had a lot of fun, but I'm also going to press you a little bit on whether or not you took the time to think about what this holiday was really all about. Was it really about some hot dogs and fireworks and a day off? Or is there something more that's at stake? We'll talk about it in just a few moments.
A press club bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and twice a week I get the opportunity to sit down and talk about some of the things that are going on in our world. And as far as I'm concerned, there are a few things that are more important than the cause of freedom, which ostensibly we celebrated yesterday with Independence Day. Now, look, I know parades and fireworks and, red, white, and blue and, the festivities and, of course, the day off work. That's all a big part of it. But I want to just pose a question as to whether you took a few moments in the course of either the holiday yesterday or maybe you've got the long holiday weekend going for you. Have you really thought about what we are celebrating? Now, I'm going to suggest there are some politically incorrect things like secession that we are celebrating. What's that you say? How could we even begin to celebrate such a thing? Wasn't that matter settled during the Civil War? Look, all I'm stating is historical fact here. But the fact of the matter is, as stated in the Declaration of Independence, there came a point where the colonists had tried to work with Great Britain, which was their legitimate government at the time. And contrary to the idea that it was, it was just taxation without representation. No, it was actually legislation without local representation, which is getting to be more and more of a familiar term to each one of us the longer time goes on. And it was the idea that government should be responsible and it should be responsive to the people closest to it. Now, the founders did a lot in the course of trying to negotiate with Britain in order to try to find a common ground where it didn't have to come to blows. They wanted to go their own way. They wanted, the crown to make certain concessions for them where they would be able to govern themselves. But at every turn, they were thwarted. In fact, at every turn, the king just kind of turned the screws a little bit tighter to demonstrate who was really in charge. And there finally came the fateful day in April of 1775 when the king's general sent his troops to Concord and Lexington to seize the arsenal of the people there. That meant their arms, it meant their ammunition, and that was where they drew the line, and they actually met them, and the shot heard around the world was fired. And it's, again, very politically incorrect to point out, but somebody came to take away the colonists' guns, and they shot them. It wasn't a matter of, well, they just rose up and they were wild-eyed yahoos. They were defending themselves from official aggression on the part of the king and his legally constituted authorities. A terribly politically incorrect thing to point out, but nonetheless, that was the flashpoint that began the Revolutionary War. It was never ordained from the very beginning that the American colonies were going to win their freedom. In fact, on paper, the odds were very much stacked against them. But as you look in the Declaration of Independence, they listed very clearly 27 separate grievances, reasons why they were choosing to, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, to withdraw their consent, noting that just government only governs with the consent of the governed. And when it comes to a point where a government is being abusive, or whether it's ignoring people's inalienable, meaning untouchable, God-given rights, then they have the right to throw off that government and to create one that will actually respond to their needs. And then the purpose of government, as clearly stated in the Declaration of Independence, which again, this is what we were celebrating. Maybe you lost it in the parades and everything, but we were celebrating the idea that there is a proper role to government and that it shouldn't depart from that role. Now, that's what set the stage for the American Revolution. It's interesting to note how many times, too, in the Declaration of Independence, they talk about, first of all, the laws of nature and nature's God. Why would they bring God into something like this? Because they believed, and they correctly believed, that our rights originate from a power higher than government itself. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody, therefore, has to line up and show up at Sunday school every Sunday. It just meant that there is a higher authority than government. There's a higher moral authority. And that is the source from which our rights are derived. Now, if you want to call it nature, the laws of nature and nature's God, that's fine. It's open to interpretation, but the bottom line is man-made authority is secondary to the natural laws that govern this world. And among those laws are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They listed their complaints. They talked about the things that they had done to try to reconcile these things with the crown and how it wouldn't be heard by the king. The king just absolutely was like, nope, I'm in charge. Shut up, he explained. And that's kind of the response we get from a lot of bureaucrats today, especially at the federal level. So here's the bottom line. They submitted those facts to a candid world when they declared that they were going to be free and independent states. It's very interesting and very worth noting that they were not a conglomeration. I know in the Pledge of Allegiance we talk about one nation indivisible, but no, they were actually divisible, which is another thing. This is the whole secession thing. Can a smaller unit detach itself from a larger unit if it chooses to? Apparently, at least as we celebrate on the 4th of July, the answer is yes, especially if they win. Now, if you read the writing of the founding fathers from throughout that conflict and even before and after, it's very clear that while there were things that they did not agree on, some were actually supporters of slavery, many were not, but did not have the political clout at that time to end wholesale an institution which was pretty much embraced by most of the civilized world at that time. Okay, they didn't invent it, but it was part of the world that they were born into. And there were those who recognized that it was a bad thing and wanted to do what they could to minimize it. But it was not something that they could solve on their own. But they did set the stage through the Constitution and through the assertion in the Declaration of Independence that we are all created equal. In other words, that every human being is born with certain inalienable rights. Now, just because it didn't come to fruition right then doesn't mean that, well, then they totally failed in their effort. They actually paved the way for that right to be, or that wrong to be righted at a different point in time. And there came that point in time, the war between the states. It could also be called, the War of Northern Aggression or the War of Involuntary Union, which purported to settle once and for all whether a state can actually leave the Union or not. Now, I'm just going to ask you to consider this without rehashing the whole Civil War. As long as two states still are part of that union, can we still call it a union? To me, the answer is yes, of course. So, but did the states voluntarily enter that union? And if the answer is yes, then should they not be able to voluntarily leave that union? Which brings us to today. I've heard some talk, and I think it was actually Kevin Roberts, who's president of the Heritage Foundation, talking about how we are on the cusp of a second American Revolution. Now, he's saying this from the standpoint of we're talking about a bloodless revolution taking place at the ballot box. And with some of the Supreme Court decisions that have come down of late, and the way that the winds of change seem to be swinging a little bit more to a more conservative, limited government point of view, it looks like the federal Leviathan has run into a few roadblocks. This is also happening at the state level. And this is something that's playing out before us in ways both big and small. But here's the thing I'm going to ask you to consider. If you feel that in some way, you're above all this, okay, I'm so sophisticated and so advanced that I don't really have to worry about that. I'm going to ask you to think again, because every single one of us at some point, at some level, has to make a decision whether we will go along with whatever government is doing, even if we recognize, okay, that's really not what it's supposed to do, or maybe in some cases it's just outright wrong. I would use, for instance, when government is using taxpayer money to pay for mutilation of kids who think that they were born in the wrong body, we're probably crossing a line of some sort. When government is involved in intervention and aggression abroad in the name of spreading democracy, which basically means anything that we want it to mean, or whatever our rule represents, it's democracy, so it must be good. You have a choice. Do I go along with it? Do I actively oppose it? Do I just shut up, kind of blend in with the crowd and try not to draw attention to myself? But here's my point. Every single one of us reaches that moment of decision at some point in our life. The point where we have to decide if we will play along, if we will participate in the lie, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn would put it, or where we may have to actually make the conscious choice to separate ourselves from so-called polite society. Now, I can't answer for you where that line in the sand is, but I know that it comes from an understanding and moral clarity, which is the same thing that animated the founding generation to stand up to Great Britain, declare their independence, and eventually fight for that independence. Here's what I'm going to ask you to consider. This is the short and simple takeaway. Yes, it was a fun holiday. We all had good food, good company, plenty of fun to go around. But what if you have rights that actually limit the power of government over you? And what if you only have as many of those rights as you are willing to claim, use, and defend? Because I believe that is the pattern that has to be followed if you wish to live as free men and women. Now, that doesn't mean that you eschew any kind of association with other people. I mean, you're free to if you want to, but most of us find that cooperative, voluntary living with others is a better way to live life and a better way to have a good, comfortable, productive kind of life. Okay, living in a cave all by yourself like Ted Kaczynski, not so much. And I wonder if, maybe that isn't what in part drove him to the madness that he finally succumbed to. Nonetheless, it's a choice that you have to make for yourself. And it's a much easier choice to make if you're actually somewhat informed as to what's at stake here. If you believe that the job of government is to tell us what our rights are and tell us what we can and can't do and do for us anything that we can't do for ourselves, that's probably something you were taught in a government school. And that's not by accident. It's not that same government school is not going to teach you that, you have the right to choose whether or not to extend or withdraw your consent. But I'm here to tell you, you do have that right. And that's a big part of what independence is. The main difference between the founding generation and our generation is they had something that currently it appears that most of American society lacks, and that is moral clarity. When is the right time to stand up, put your foot down, and either declare or through your actions show that I will not yield any more of my rights? Now, that's not a call for blood, but it's a recognition that the will to stand up and, if necessary, fight for your rights has always been a requirement of being a free person. And here's the other thing that you need to remember. It's not a matter of someone in authority telling you, okay, now we've reached the point where I'm being oppressive and you have the right to stand up to me. They're never going to do that. You will become a free individual when you choose to be a free individual. But I want to caution you. Freedom is not predicated on the idea that I get to do anything I want as much as I want. And, I'm sorry to pick on Charlie Sheen, but Charlie Sheen's a good example of a guy who could do anything he wanted to and did anything he wanted to, and more or less, in many ways, ruined his life in the process, ruined his family, ruined his health, his mental well-being, and so forth. Freedom is predicated on principles and practices that require the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. If you're not clear on that, that's something you can work on. You can do that in the comfort of your own home. You don't need to go to some official school. You don't have to go to even official church to tell you right from wrong. Although you will find that there are resources out there that are helpful in this. But never forget, as you see all the different political intrigues and battles playing out before us, ultimately, at some point, it's going to come down to a decision of, do I choose to exert my independence or not? Again, I can't answer that question for you, but I want to encourage you that it's an important enough question. You should probably be working on an answer, because the day is going to come when you will have to answer it. And you may want to go along with the crowd for safety's sake, or you may want to bravely stand up by yourself and say, this is where I make my stand. That's a choice you get to make. I hope it's the right one. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
A press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark